My name is Elizabeth Janus, and I am the chair of the League of Women Voters of Hingham. Welcome to our annual Warrant Review Forum. The League of Women Voters of Hingham is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages informed and active citizen participation in government. As an organization, we don't support or endorse a political party. We work to increase understanding of public policy issues, and we influence policy through our studies, member consensus, and then advocacy. In 2011, Hingham voters unanimously supported our League's Warrant article. This made the warrant available to the public 10 days after the January 20th deadline. The sponsors' names must also be included. We believe earlier access to the warrant allows citizens and boards optimal opportunity to research the articles and allows citizens to engage in the review process and ask questions at the various board hearings. Boards also benefit from earlier voter input. 6 years ago, we added the Warrant Review Forum. Tonight, we have provided for you the most recent copy of the Advisory Committee Status Summary. Please make note of the hearing dates so that you can attend these meetings. The document is also on the town's website for those at home. Our League also produced the Citizens Guide to Open Town Meeting booklet, which is available here at the Forum, the Selectman's Office, the Town Clerk's Office, and the Hingham Public Library. If you are new to town, this is a practical way to learn about the legislative practice of your open town meeting. We hope to see you at town meeting on April the 23rd. And of course, we always welcome new male and female members to our League. And now I would like to welcome and thank Advisory Chair Lucy Hancock, who will be reviewing the Advisory Committee process and address some of the articles that might be of interest. Lucy, if you don't mind, could we hold any audience questions until the end, as we want to ensure that we're able to cover the full presentation?
It sounds fine to me, and thank you for the intro, and welcome to all of you who are here to find out about our town government. I'm going to talk primarily about two things, the budget and the warrant articles. And the budget is part of the warrant. It's actually a very large part of the warrant, but we have a lot of very interesting other articles to talk about as well. So I'll try to give you a quick summary. If there's anything that I don't cover, you have questions, you'll be able to come up to the podium after I finish and ask them. And if there's something I can't answer here, I'll be glad to follow up with you afterward. So let me grab my clicker and move to the first slide, which is just talking about what we're going to cover. We'll talk about the fiscal year 19 budget, which starts, the fiscal year 19 starts 6/30/18. We will talk about the warrant article process and our calendar. We will talk about the 2018 warrant articles, and then I will take questions. Welcome, come right in. The Advisory Committee, of which I am the chair, it's a 15-member volunteer committee appointed by the moderator, and there are staggered terms, so each year you may have 2 or 3 people rolling off and being replaced by others. Each member can serve up to 2 3-year terms. It serves as the town's finance committee, and we review town budgets and town meeting articles, and we recommend action to the town. I'm a big fan of town meeting. I've always enjoyed it. I think it's a great way to go find out what happens. We are one of the towns that still has a full town meeting, not a representative town meeting. I'd encourage all of you to be there if you can, to become knowledgeable, as Elizabeth said, in advance, but also to feel free to speak up at town meeting if you have questions. We have a lot of really interesting volunteers in town, very willing people who step up to the plate to serve on our town boards and committees. I'll put a plug in here for the talent bank application you'll find at the back of the warrant. It's a place for you to state your interest in town government, and if you'd like to be on a committee or a board, that's the place to fill out the application and submit it to a place it indicates at the bottom of the application. Let's see. Oh, I also want to say I'm very impressed with the caliber of the employees in town, the people we work with. We work closely with people in town hall in all the various departments, and it's been a very good working relationship with all of them. Okay, the fiscal year 2019 budget. We review municipal budgets, of which there are many, the education budget, and the capital outlay budget. Our approach is to understand departmental priorities and the service levels from those priorities. We look at significant changes year over year, over several years. We look for abnormalities. We look for large increases or decreases in budget amounts. We assess the financial impact, both for current and future years, and we try to demonstrate fairness, balance, and equity. We look at all aspects of the budget process, including the results and goals of the departments. It's a balanced approach. We're trying to meet the needs within our constrained budget. And yes, it is constrained. Every year it's constrained, and we seem to find a way to balance it, but it is a challenge. At the bottom of that slide, you'll see the comment in red. The committee's budget recommendation reflects a consensus balancing affordable cost with acceptable service levels among the advisory committee, the originating group, and the Board of Selectmen. Budget consideration. We look at budget trends and goal achievement. Each of the departments comes to the advisory committee to present their budget. We look at the request, the impact of the request on service levels. Will we be able to maintain level services with the budget? We look at the impact of additional funding requests beyond level services. And we look at the impact of the request on the overall financial health, including the bond rating and the town financial policy. We ultimately recommend a certain amount for each budget. The department heads will come in with a base budget, and oftentimes we'll have a request for an additional amount for something beyond level services. Additional requests are usually considered at the end of the budget process. We look at each of the budgets. We get recommendations from liaisons from advisory to the departments, and we save the additional requests for the end, because sometimes those are the things that we have to unfortunately eliminate if there's a budget crunch. So those are the last thing we would look at. The financial policy elements at the bottom. The unassigned fund balance is, according to our financial policy, is supposed to be 16 to 20% of total annual expenditures. And TAE, or total annual expenditures, is equal to our Articles 4, 5, and 6 in the warrant. We are currently at 22.31% as of 6/30/17, the end of fiscal year 17. The capital outlay goal is 2 to 5% of the operating budget. We're currently at 2.85 at the end of fiscal year 17. And just so you know, the operating budget is the total annual expenditures minus employee benefits, debt service, sewer, and country club. And the debt service goal is 5 to 7.5% of total annual expenditures. We have consistently, for the past few years, been above that. We've been at 9.2%, but I don't take that as a problem. I think it's more a matter of we need to look at our financial policy and just see how we are measuring our debt service and whether we're using the correct tools. Revenue growth is slowing down. We have the problem of the revenue increases slowing down and the revenue expenses are speeding up. So, at some point we have to figure out how to fix that. And cutting expenses always seems easier than raising revenue, but it's really not. We have to figure out a way to balance the two so that all the proper departments are funded and we still come to a balanced budget. So year over year operating revenue growth, you see in the red, those are actual numbers for the most part, whereas the last one, which is fiscal year 20 to 23, is projected. You can see the slowdown, 3.5, 2.8, 2.2. We anticipate a continued slowdown in the rate of revenue growth. This slide shows you the 5-year trend, fiscal year 13 to 18, excluding capital, for operating expenses. Gives you an idea of the annual percentage change, giving us an average overall of 4.6% and an average annual dollar change of $4 million. Over 80% of our expenses are personnel related. As you can well imagine, people cost a lot of money. You figure in the benefits, you figure in the salaries, you figure in the additional costs, the expenses surrounding people. And you just can't raise taxes to accommodate the personnel needs every year. You have to find a way to try to limit the tax increase. We have a 2% limit every year, and we try to average it so that we don't have to go above that 2.5%. I'm just going to say quickly, there are some creative departments this year that have done things like cut their personnel current salary costs, but they've ended up adding someone at a consultant level at a lower cost. So the net benefit is there's a reduction overall in their budget, and they figured out a way to do that to allow them to come in with a more reasonable budget for us. We've another one where they've learned to use some revolving funds to help offset some of the salaries, so they can then lower the overall cost of salary. So we're always looking for creative ways to do things. Education is about 50% of the town's budget. That's been pretty steady for the past few years. The school administration presents a budget to the school committee. The school committee and the administration then present the budget to the Board of Selectmen and the advisory committee. Advisory committee makes the final decision on the education budget, just as it does for the municipal budgets. But the school committee has the actual authority to spend the pool of money that they are given. This slide shows you the percent of total spending over the various categories of government. And you can see it ranges from 0.5 for unclassified all the way to 50.1 for education and everything else in between over the course of the same 5 years we've talked about before, the fiscal years. Next slide is about capital outlay. We have a committee called the Capital Outlay Committee that develops a capital budget and brings it to advisory and Board of Selectmen. And we include the capital expenses in the operating budget, which is Article 6. We are trying very much over time to increase the amount we spend on capital, because we all know deferred maintenance is a problem, and we don't want to have our buildings and equipment falling apart if we can try to keep up and replace it at a time when it makes more sense. It's very important to invest in our capital, the buildings, the new police cars, the DPW trucks, making significant repairs to buildings and buying new technology. During the financial crisis back in 2008-9, we took a few years off from doing much of anything for capital, and we've been trying to build it back. And as you can see, we're still hovering between, say, 2.5% to 3%. And note that the fiscal year 18 number is still the appropriated number. That's not actual. We have now actual 17 numbers. We have the appropriated 18 numbers, but we're still in fiscal year 18, and we have forecasted or budget numbers for 19. The capital is from the tax levy and mooring permit fees. The ratio is you take the capital number and divide it by the operating budget. So one of the budgets we'll be looking at next week when we look at all the budgets is capital. The budget process, as of Monday night, the 26th, there is a $1.23 million budget deficit. It's big. We've had bigger, we've had smaller. We will manage to close it. We will have a balanced budget, but it is a challenge. The recent events, the forecast was updated with new information on Monday night. The school committee voted the budget recommended by the school administration. Last night, the Board of Selectmen met and voted all budgets, and on the 6th of March, next Tuesday, the advisory committee will vote all budget. The Board of Selectmen presented a path to a balanced budget last night, very helpful, and the advisory committee will use that info as input to our budget discussions, starting actually tomorrow night, but actually voting on Tuesday night. The current forecast includes the most recent education budget, additional municipal request recommended by the town administrator, the most recent revenue forecast, and a significant adjustment from the Group Insurance Commission for the cost of health insurance. These are all things that we look at when we look at the forecast. Town meeting process. Nice little chart there. I hope you can see it. The text is kind of small. Across the top, you will see the places where and we're moving into the warrant articles now, just to let you know. I'm done with the budget for the moment. This is the sources of warrant articles. They can come from the Board of Selectmen, the Planning Board, those are mostly zoning articles, the Community Preservation Committee, also known as CPC, another town sponsor, a department, a board, or a committee, and finally, citizen petitioners. The citizens' petitions go to the town clerk. The other requests all go through the assistant town administrator, who's like the traffic cop for all of the warrant articles. And from there, there is a preliminary review of the articles by town council to make sure that they're ready for prime time and are ready to be put out on the website. And then the process is the Board of Selectmen and the Advisory Committee review the warrant articles. At the end of the process, after the voting, the Advisory Committee writes the recommended motions and the comments for those articles, and they're then turned into the Assistant Town Administrator, and then again reviewed by the moderator and town council for any possible changes. And then it comes to the warrant, and then annual town meeting, and all of you will see the comments and recommended motions. There's typically various types of warrant articles. We have what's called perennials. You'll see them pretty much every year. They may have slightly different numbers in them, but they are commonly things that we need to do every year. Certain spending, certain approvals, certain reports. There are annual articles that are needed to be handled by town meeting due to state law. There are spending articles which require town meeting approval because we are either moving money or spending money. And moving off the perennials, there are, as I said, annual Community Preservation Act money, and I'll talk about that a little later in the slides. There are, this year, there were no citizen petition articles. For some reason, no citizens put an article up, so they're all coming from those other sources I mentioned. This year, we have 35 warrant articles. It's down a bit, but we happen to have a lot of zoning articles, which more than we normally do, which makes it kind of interesting. The Board of Selectmen typically hears articles before the Advisory Committee and also votes articles before the Advisory Committee does so. The Board of Selectmen hearings and votes are meant to inform the Advisory Committee, to give us additional information. And the next slide is the calendar. Per the town bylaw, town meeting must occur on the fourth Monday in April, and this year that's April 23rd. We're all hoping for a one-night meeting. I believe last year was 2 nights, the prior year was 1 night. We've been known to go 3 nights. If we go to a 3-night town meeting, we normally don't do it all in the same week. We would do a Monday, Tuesday, and then the following Monday. But I'm going to tell you that you can keep your fingers crossed that we have a 1-night meeting. It depends on how the discussion on the articles goes. So don't make plans for either Monday or Tuesday, just in case you need to come back, because we need that quorum. Okay, so the notice, which is called the warrant, must be delivered to citizens at least 7 days before a town meeting. So if you look at the schedule below, the budget schedule, I've talked about the timing a little bit. The assumptions come in from the departments. They're worked on in October. Actually in November, the budgets are developed, and then they are put in a budget book. And for us, that's a big binder, and we call it the budget book. And we start our budget hearings in December. And they run through January, February, and March. We pretty much have 4 months of budget-related hearings, but we mostly focus on December and January, and then we pick up on looking at warrant articles. Then we go back to the budget in March for voting purposes. So the warrant schedule is the street acceptances are due in July. The CPC applications are due in October, although I believe the preliminaries are now due in August. There's an earlier deadline now. You have to put a preliminary app in, and then you follow up in September or October with the final. December, zoning articles are due. Other articles are due at the end of January, or the middle to the end of January. And then during February and March, the Board of Selectmen and the Advisory Committee have the article hearings and votes. And that's what we're doing now. We're in the middle of that process. All right, the next slide talks about some of the perennial articles, not all of them. These are the perennials that don't require additional funding by town meeting. Some of them involve money, but it doesn't necessarily have to come from our pockets. The Board of Selectmen hears these hearings and votes on them, and that's another point of reference for the Advisory Committee. quickly the ones that are listed up here. We have one called the Hannah Lincoln Whiting Fund. That's appointing a trustee for a small fund, a small amount of money, which hands out a little bit of the interest every year. The DCR is the town assumes liability for work that the Department of Conservation and Recreation does in town. We have an article that accepts reports of various town committees and also discharges any committees that were appointed by the town meeting. We have accepting the report of the Personnel Board and their recommendations. That turns into what we call our Article 4, which I'll talk about later. We have the fixing the salaries of town officers, the electric light plant minimum, that has to do with a pilot, a payment in lieu of taxes that the electric light department pays to the town. The Building Department revolving fund and the Department of Elder Services revolving funds are articles that allow town meeting to authorize the amount, the top amount, the limit upon which the two different departments can spend for that particular revolving fund. And finally, the acceptance of easements. That's an article that allows the Board of Selectmen and us to accept easements, typically for utility purposes. So moving into what I call the articles that don't involve funding. There aren't that many of them this year because almost everything else involves some kind of funding or a zoning related article. The street acceptance for Lewis Court is to accept as a town way the extension of Lewis Court, which is a right-of-way, a town road off of Hershey Street, to acquire 2.231 acres of land from a developer, that being Alliance, the developer of the project off Beale Street, where the old Hingham Mutual was. That property is adjacent to Bear Cove Park. It's an acceptance of land from the developer, and it will be considered part of Bear Cove Park, but it will not be subject to the same federal restrictions that Bear Cove Park is subject to. The naming of conservation land off South Pleasant Street, if you recall, I think it was 2 years ago, the town used community preservation money to purchase the Laner property off South Pleasant Street. This article is to name the property officially the Laner Conservation Area. The next one is to amend a general bylaw related to the Hingham Affordable Housing Trust, and that will allow the Housing Trust to have additional powers to act as the lottery and monitoring agent for affordable housing if they need to take on that responsibility. And finally, the adoption of the Stretch Energy Code. This is a part of our state building code, and up to this point, Hingham has been using the base energy code of the state building code. This is a request for the town to adopt the Stretch Energy Code, and the reason that is significant is there is a expectation that Hingham will apply for the Green Communities designation, and that one of the requirements for being a green community is to have adopted the Stretch Energy Code. Moving on to community preservation. As you may know, we have a local Community Preservation Act tax. The surcharge is 1.5% of real property taxes, plus there's a state match, so those two combined give us the funds that we use to spend on our CPA projects. The starting point this year was 1.573847, about $1.6 million of available funds. The total for the 9 projects this year is about $1.1 million. We also have some set-asides, which you won't see up here because it's not one of our projects. I mentioned the Laner property. We did approve that a couple of years ago, but we continued to set aside money for the debt on that property. Several years before that, the Community Preservation Act money was used to borrow for the Heritage Museum, and that's a little bit closer to being paid off. So there's money being set aside for both of those. The Heritage Museum is about $165,000, and the Laner property, $315,000. Those are set-asides. But I will talk a little bit about the projects that are on for this year. The CPC Administrative Fund is an annual amount we use to help pay the administrative costs for the CPC, plus potentially some other expenses. The Hingham Affordable Housing Trust Opportunity Fund for $464,500. The Affordable Housing Trust has a fund that's used to be able to purchase property, houses, condominiums on short notice. If something comes up, they want the ability to be able to purchase that and put it into the affordable housing inventory. So this year we were fortunate to have some additional money from what I call clawbacks from another property that was involved with the community preservation, and we had that, plus we had our 10% of our normal reserve and some additional funding for the trust. So we put the money, we're putting the money in the Opportunity Fund. The next one is conservation of historic town records. We've been working on preservation and conservation for several years now. This is a small amount, but it will help us to conserve and preserve birth, death, and marriage records, among other things. They're quite old and quite interesting. The Hingham Historical Society has a lot of information about old records, as well as the library. There's a room in the library for historical records, so a good thing to think about if you're interested in history. The Hingham Cemetery Erosion Control Project, $15,000. There is a section of the Hingham Cemetery, which is the cemetery behind the old ship church. It goes up from Water Street, it goes up from North Street. It's the central cemetery in downtown Hingham with very old graves. There's a section close to where the old ship church is, where the erosion is causing risk to some very old headstones and gravestones. So the hope is that the Hingham Cemetery would be able to spend some money to shore up the land there so it doesn't cave in on the graves. The restoration for mechanisms are the two bells in the Hingham Memorial Bell Tower, $28,535. Several years ago, the CPA money was used to shore up the tower to provide some internal steel beams and structures to support the bells. They are quite heavy. There's a number of them. I don't know if there's 9 or 11, but there's 10. Thank you, Julie. There's 10 bells. And 2 of them are in the condition where they need to be restored. So this is the money for those bells. If you ever have a chance to go up into the bell tower, especially when the change ringers are playing the bells, do so. It's fascinating to see what they do. Site survey, number 6, the old Fort House that was on Fort Hill Street, there's a portion of that building that was actually an old fort. It belonged to John Richardson. When he died and the property was sold, the Hingham Historical Society moved the older portion of that building to the Lincoln Street property behind the old ordinary. And this money is going to help us to be able to put the old Fort House on a permanent foundation, and also to do a little bit of archaeological study to make sure we're putting it on a place that's safe. There's nothing buried underneath it that we might want to dig out later. Okay, the next page of community preservation, the Harbor Boardwalk Extension Project. We've been spending money on this for a couple years now. The first part of the boardwalk went across the front of the bathing beach. The next piece, which was approved last year, I believe, was to extend the boardwalk up into the Grove area as you're looking at the water up to the left. And this year, the hope is to extend the boardwalk over toward the boat ramp. And if there's enough money left over to do a little work on a walkway between the beach and the yet-to-be-built but expected bathhouse, which was talked about the past couple of years. And I believe they're hoping to start construction this year. So that should complete, complete our boardwalks. The Hull Street Playground, there was a playground for years on Hull Street, and if you drive by that location now, it's beyond the monastery. You will see empty ground. There's nothing there. It's a sort of a 2-level piece of property, but the upper level had a playground on it, and it was removed because it became unsafe and there was no money to maintain it. But the Recreation Department is hoping to spend $85,000 to construct a new playground. It's modest. It's nothing big, but it will be a nice place for the neighborhood children to come and play. And finally, partial funding for the design and construction of plans for the possible replacement of the South Shore Country Club pool, $300,000. Most of you have probably read about the controversy over the problems with our pool at the country club, that it's gradually going to have to close because it won't last forever. It already has some issues, structural issues. So the Country Club Management Committee and others in town have been working to figure out a way to replace the pool, and what would it look like and where would it be. They're hoping to have finalization of the plans and the costs at a point in the near future, along with a study of what it would cost to operate it. So meanwhile, there's a a plan to spend $300,000 on design and construction plans, plus that would include $350,000 of fundraising being done by the Friends of the Country Club, Friends of the Pool. So those two amounts together would give the Country Club Management Committee hopefully enough money to do the design and construction plans. But the money will not be spent until all of the funds have been pledged, all of the fundraising has been done, and there is a sustainable operating plan for the pool, and there is a reasonable and effective way to raise the capital, to provide the capital to do the pool project, which is estimated at about $10 million. So it's a big project. Okay, moving to other articles that involve funding. And I will say that the first 5 of these are perennials. I didn't put them on the perennial page because they do involve funding, but you will see every year, report of the Personnel Board. You'll see the budgets, that's Article 6, the transfer from stabilization, transfer from meals tax stabilization, and transfer of funds to the reserve fund. The 4 below it are actually articles for this year that are new, and they involve the purchase of equipment or replacement repairs. There's a sewer extension permit cost there, and I'll talk about those on later slides. The reserve fund, I want to just make it clear, we have a reserve fund in town that we vote money for every year in town meeting. We vote to put money in it for the following year. However, at the end of the year, we often have overages. We need to do transfers to certain departments. For example, snow and ice. It's very hard to judge how much money you're going to need to pay for the plowing in the winter. And sometimes we have gone over, like 3 years ago. So sometimes there's other departments. There's legal costs that may go over. There's workers' comp thing may go over. We need to do transfers from the reserve fund for these departments. So by the end of March, early April, we usually know approximately what we're going to need to fund the rest of this fiscal year. So this article is transferring funds to the reserve fund for the use in this fiscal year to accommodate all of the possible needs we may have by the end of June. And normally we vote the reserve fund transfers in June at the end of the fiscal year. The other ones, Personnel Board, I talked about earlier. That's our Article 4, which allows for the inclusion of any personnel who are not under contract through a union. It includes the 2% increase for any contracts that have not been completed. And this year, I think we have the cost of a wage and classification study in there as well. But that one, you'll see every year, it's normally $300,000 to $400,000. Could be less, could be more. Budgets we've talked about, that's Article 6. I will say that you'll hear me talk about article numbers. Right now, the articles are lettered because we don't know how many articles there will be. We do not know the order they will appear in the warrant. So we have letters. I didn't put the numbers or the letters on here. I didn't want to confuse things. So if I talk about Article 6, because I know that we're going to have Article 6 as the budget, and I know Article 4 is always the report of the Personnel Board. The Meals Tax Stabilization Fund and the other stabilization fund, we sold buildings in the past. We also had some bond premiums. They've gone into the stabilization fund. We take a certain amount every year to offset the tax rate, to lower the tax rate. The Meals Tax Stabilization Fund, in prior years, we have put the proceeds from the meals tax in this fund. Again, we take a chunk of it every year and apply it to help reduce the tax rate. The Meals Tax Stabilization Fund will go to zero soon because we are now putting the meals tax receipts directly into local receipts. So if you don't see it there after a few years, it's because we still have meals tax revenue, but it's going directly into our local receipts, and we don't need to thereby vote every year to take money out of it. Okay, moving on to funds for purchase of fire aerial apparatus. And if I go back one, you'll see that was the fourth one up from the bottom. That's $500,000. We're referring to this as the AA, the aerial apparatus. I call it the fire truck. But we currently have a truck called the Quint, which is 20 years old. It's a workhorse. It goes out for a lot of calls. It has a ladder. It does not have a bucket at the end of the ladder. And we have a lot of buildings being built in town now. We could really use a bigger ladder and a better bucket, or a bucket, which we don't have. So the aerial apparatus has all the functions of the Quint, plus a platform bucket mounted at the top of the ladder. It will cost 1,450,000 to 1,500,000. That's the estimated cost, and that includes the cost of tools and equipment to outfit the truck. When we get the truck, we don't always have all the stuff that goes on it, so there's an additional amount. The developer of the Avalon Hingham shipyard, if you've driven by there, you can see the buildings are coming along. They're up. The developer has agreed to contribute $1 million toward the purchase of the aerial apparatus. And the town then needs to fund the balance of that. So the town recommends that we borrow the $500,000 to fund the balance of the cost of the aerial apparatus. Next one is the sewer extension permit. That was also on the smaller print one I showed you. This is the third from the bottom. The town is proposing that Barnes Wharf and the Hingham Public Library be connected to the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority sewer service. That's the MWRA. I'm sure you're all familiar with that acronym. To connect them to sewer service in Hingham. If the MWRA agrees to consider the request, we have to ask them first if we can apply for it. If they say yes, we submit an application and to obtain the permits for the extension of sewer service to these properties. Most of the cost of this article, which is $55,300, relates to the engineering needed to complete the permit. What do we need to do to find out what it would involve to connect these areas to the sewer service? We're going to use available reserves, also known as fund balance, to provide the revenue for this, the source of funds for this particular article. If the MWRA grants the permits, then the town will be responsible for the cost of hooking up these properties to the sewer lines. This does not get you a sewer connection. It just says that we have a permit from the MWRA if we decide we are going to hook up those properties. Town wharves. I'm going to go ahead one slide first just to show you something. Have you seen this picture? It was taken January 30th on a high tide in Hingham. We're having another high tide on Friday. You might want to drive down to the harbor. Don't get too close, but we could have another semi-flooding situation. The water's right up to the level of the town pier. We've had a couple of instances with storms in the past few years when we've seen similar situations. So I think that's a pretty effective slide to show that our town piers probably need to be a little more resilient. In 2015, town meeting appropriated $175,000 for the repair and restoration of the town wharves. Basically, that was phase one of looking at the town wharves. In 2017, last year, town meeting appropriated an additional $240,000 for the continuation of that project and to finish what I'm calling phase two, the engineering, design, and permitting for 4 town-owned wharves. We hope at the end of phase two, using that remaining money, we'll know what it will cost to do the entire 4 wharves, to repair, replace, make them more resilient. The purpose of this article is to apply for a state grant of up to $1 million that's contingent on a match from the town. So this article would provide up to $200,000 to match up to $1 million. Ideally, if we apply for $1 million, the Seaport Bond Council will say, show us your money. Do you have $200,000? And if we do, maybe they'll say, okay, you get $1 million. And then we have 1.2 to put toward the actual construction, whichever wharf we decide to do first. And the option is also that the grant is for less than that amount. But this idea is to say we're willing to fund up to $200,000, and that would be borrowing. We would borrow the money to fund that piece. Eventually, the cost of the wharf construction will be done via borrowing. I showed you the high tide at Town Pier. We can skip that one. The next one on that prior slide of funds, articles requiring funding, is the high school gymnasium wall. During this past winter, just a few weeks ago actually, the school department personnel discovered some structural deficiencies in the glass block windows in the high school gym. If you're in the gym and you look up, you will see very high up that the wall turns into windows. Light comes through, but you can't see through them because they're so high up. The article that we're talking about here requests $60,000 to fund the structural assessment and design of the replacement of the windows and related work. The source of funds is to be determined. We'll know that definitely by next week. I think actually the Board of Selectmen voted this last night, and I think they're planning to use available funds for this, which would be fund balance. It's likely that if this is a successful venture, looking at the structural deficiencies, we'll have a number for this project, and the town meeting of 2019 will include an article related to the actual construction costs. Don't know that for sure, but it would seem that would be a logical follow-on to this one. And just so you're not worried when you go to town meeting, the school department either has or is installing netting in the gym to address any possible safety issues. We don't expect anything to fall down, but if something should happen, we have netting there. Okay, now we get to the zoning articles. If you've been reading the paper, you know we have a marijuana issue in front of us, and that the state is in the process of developing state regulations for the sale of recreational marijuana. And because Hingham voted no on the state ballot question about recreational marijuana, we had the option to wait till June. We have a moratorium on the sale of marijuana. We also don't need to go to a ballot vote, but we do need to have a town meeting vote if we're going to ban the sale of marijuana on a recreational basis. So there is a zoning bylaw, which is called Section 3, Ban on Marijuana Establishments. There's also a general bylaw to ban marijuana establishments. Then there's a zoning bylaw for the regulation of marijuana establishments. That would be time, manner, place. If the ban is not voted, we would need to regulate the sale of marijuana. So where is it sold? How is it sold? Where can it be ingested or smoked or whatever you may want to do? And if that article doesn't pass, we would go to something called definitions related to marijuana not medically prescribed. It's a little bit broader interpretation. I'm not going to even get into the zoning language with you because it's really complicated. But if the zoning bylaw, if the ban does not succeed, we would have to go to a sales tax article, and the town could decide if the town wants to impose up to, I think it's a 3% sales tax on the sale of marijuana. However, if the bans are passed, and keep in mind that the zoning bylaw is a 2/3 vote in order to succeed. If the ban is passed, it has to have 2/3. And if the ban article succeeds for the town, that's a majority vote, so that's 50%. If those bans succeed, we would then probably, well, definitely, we'd go to the other articles, but we would vote no action on them. We wouldn't need to vote in regulation of establishments or definitions or sales tax, but we would be considering it no action. So the advisory committee has to write up the comments on this to be, well, if this happens, we'll do this, and if that happens, we'll do that. So, and I think it'll be very clear at town meeting. The moderator will make it very clear to you as to how we're going to vote and how we're going to discuss these. The final article on here is registered marijuana dispensaries. It's unrelated to the recreational marijuana. It's really cleaning up existing zoning language related to medical marijuana, and we're not changing anything that we decided about those dispensaries. They're legal. They can come to the town and petition to establish them. So it's on here because it's a zoning bylaw, but it's really not part of the marijuana discussion that we'll have. Other zoning bylaw amendment articles. I'll briefly just tell you the last 5 on there are mostly clarifications and cleanup. We do these a lot. If you're familiar with the warrant, every year we seem to have warrant articles which have a lot of very technical language. They don't significantly affect anything we're doing. They may be, as I said, clarifying, cleaning up, responding to something else to make it a more reasonable zoning article if something else has changed, for example. The only one that will cause a certain amount of discussion is the first one, which is called ADU, accessory dwelling units. And I'm just going to read you what the definition is of an accessory dwelling unit, because people have asked me, and I always make a mistake without reading it. An accessory dwelling unit is a second self-contained dwelling unit, subordinate in size to the principal dwelling on a lot and incorporated within the principal dwelling. A principal dwelling for the purpose of this article will be a single-family dwelling. A single-family dwelling with an accessory dwelling unit shall not be deemed to be a two-family dwelling. The most common use, I would say, of accessory dwelling unit would be to have a relative living with you, an in-law apartment, a brother, a sister, a child, someone else in the family living there. So there's been a lot of talk about this. In fact, tonight, the planning board, I believe, is looking at it again. I think there'll be some significant discussion about it at town meeting. And the language is still in the works, but you will have a lot of interesting technical text to look at, but you'll be able to get the gist of it by the person who explains the article to you at town meeting, and you'll know what you're voting on. So when you hear ADUs, that's what we're going to be talking about. Resources. I hope you all know we have a Hingham website for the town, lots of good stuff on it. We have an events calendar, which lists all the hearing dates for the various boards and committees. It also has other events on there other than town boards and committees. And then on the Hingham website, if you go to the government menu, you can page down to the advisory committee page on the town website. And on that website is the warrant article status summary, which Elizabeth kindly made available to you tonight. We refer to that as the WAS. It's updated at least once a week, tells you when the hearings are or were, when the votes have been taken for both the Board of Selectmen and for the advisory committee, and it gives you the vote counts, so you know what the decision was on that article. It contains the current warrant articles. It hasn't had the most recent forecast, but that will be up there soon. That's our revenue forecast, which also includes expenses. That's where we want to go to a zero balance. That's what we will show you when we're done. It has the advisory committee calendar, when our meetings are, and I will tell you that we're meeting tomorrow night and 3 nights next week, and then we take a little breather and we start meeting again. We'll probably be meeting once or twice a month in March and April and May and June. Probably take a week or so after this next week's meetings because we need to have time to develop the comments. The recommendations and the comments that you see in the warrant are from the advisory committee. And after all these hearings and votes, the AdCom liaisons need to go and work on those, and they need to be added in and finalized. And finally, there is a citizen's guide to participating in town meeting. If you'd like to read that, it's very informative. So I think that takes us to the end. A little picture of chairs. Our future, our choices, our town. And the last slide is for questions. And we have 10 minutes before 8 o'clock. We can go longer. I can stay longer. You can come up to the podium and ask a question if you have any. And yes, you do have to come to the podium because we are being filmed tonight for later replay. We didn't get the live action tonight. That goes to the planning board. They're getting live on Harbor Media, Channel 9. But this will be replayed at some future point, or you can actually go on the Harbor Media website and search for it and tell your friends if they want to see the warrant article review. It'll be out there. So are there questions? Don't be afraid. Just tell us who you are, and then...
Marissa Costello, Partridge Drive. My question is, and I may have missed it when you were talking about it, the wharf project.
Yes.
Have we already assessed what needs to be done and have a drawing or architectural plan, or will part of this money be used to do that?
The Harbor Development Committee would love to sit down with you and tell you what they've got. We've come up with, or I should say they've come up with the 4 wharves. It's Town Pier, the old Mobile Station property, Barnes Wharf, and, what's the other one? Whitney Wharf. No, not Whitney Wharf. The Veterans Wharf. I don't think I have it with me. I'm sorry. No, it's not a steamboat. It's Barnes. The wharves have been identified. The preliminary work has been done with the engineers to determine what needs to be done. But with the remaining money that was assigned last year, the Harbor Development Committee hopes to come up with the quotes, the bids, the bid information they need, the information they need to put out the bid to do the work, and a very clear idea of what it will cost to do all of them. And it's millions of dollars. It's a huge amount of money. And they probably won't do them all at once because it takes time and we need the money for it. So they hope to get started on the construction as soon as they have money. Other questions? Nancy, come on up.
Nancy McDonald. I was just wondering if you could explain the decreasing revenue given the fact that the home prices are burgeoning?
Well, we're limited in what we can, I should have brought a certain slide with me, and I didn't. We're limited in what we can do to raise because of Prop 2.5. We get state revenue, which we don't always know until, we don't even have the final number yet. We get a pretty good approximation of what the governor has recommended and whether the State House is going to go along with that. We have local receipts, which have a lot to do with things like motor vehicle excise taxes. Go out and buy a new car, it'll boost our local receipts. We've looked at the forecast multiple times so far this year, and we think we've squeezed everything we can out of the available revenues. I'm trying to think how to phrase this. The Hingham has a lower property tax rate than some towns. It has very high house prices, and it has the taxes themselves are lower than some other towns. People move here because the taxes aren't as high. We try to keep it that way. Excuse me, Jim? The rate is lower, right, it is. But as I said, we're limited too by what we can spend with Prop 2.5 and how much growth there is. Now, if we had more growth in town, which we're hoping we will at some point, not so much residential growth, but commercial growth, we would boost our revenues. So when you hear people talking about the South Hingham development, they're talking about the industrial park, some of the property off Whiting Street, the Bristol Brothers property. If we had significant development out there, that would increase our base, our commercial tax base. The other thing that happened this year, which we weren't sure about, health insurance is very costly, as you know. And we recently, last year, we went with the GIC, a different health insurance plan. And you may have seen in the local papers or state Boston papers that there was a decision by the GIC, the Group Insurance Commission, to take some plans away. And then there was a hue and cry about that, and they agreed to put them back. Well, we were afraid that might raise the rate of increase for the town. But it turns out we had some positive news from the GIC that our expected 10% increase was not that much. So one reason why the forecast, the deficit has gone down is because our numbers for the GIC, that being one of our expenses, went down. It wasn't because the revenue went up. So in answer to your question, there is a way to raise revenue, but it's going to take time. It's going to take time to bring commercial development in. And we don't want our taxpayers to have to endure increasing revenues, you're increasing tax rates every year. And we are limited by 2.5. Does that help? You sound like you've got more questions.
It's just never made sense to me that the value of our housing stock continues to rise. And I understand, and I know the rate, but the rate on top of that, a rising number, it doesn't make sense to me that our overall revenue, and I understand the expenses, I understand all that part of it, but it doesn't make sense to me that the revenue itself is going down when our housing.
I have a slide that I didn't bring with me. I don't think I have it, which would be helpful, and I can email that to you if you would like.
And also, you drive through town, there's just so much development. Even up on Derby Street, we have new car dealerships, we have new businesses up and down there. So it just doesn't feel as a citizen like we're not doing well. It feels like we're booming.
I know, and we are doing well. We're a well-managed town. We have a good fund balance. But one of the concerns with the fund balance is, which is our rainy day fund, is that over time, the ratio, if the denominator is the total annual expenditures, if that keeps going up and we keep spending more, and the
and I understand the expenditures. I get
fund balance doesn't go up more, the ratios.
Right. It's the total revenue.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I'd be glad to talk to you about it afterward. I just didn't bring the numbers, and I don't want to speak incorrectly. Other questions? Jim? You want to come up to the podium? Because the people at home won't be able to hear you unless you come up to the podium.
Sure. Having trouble reading it. But.
It's the print is very small on the WAS.
Question in regards to the acceptance of the public parkland.
Yes.
Are you familiar with it?
I am familiar,
Something about 2 acres or something?
it's 2.231 acres. It's a piece of property right behind the Hingham Mutual.
I mean, the previous one was 4 acres or something. I'm trying to figure out where the.
Where it
difference-
is?
Where the difference came from 4 to 2.
You mean the original amount was 4?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with
Well,
that.
prior to this rendition of the conservation restriction.
Okay, I'm referring back to the agreement made with
Most recent.
Alliance.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm wondering why it's different. You see what I'm saying?
Different from an earlier agreement?
Right.
I don't know.
Not with them, but prior.
Prior to that with someone else? Do you want to elaborate a little bit?
Well, from the original developer and from the insurance company, and it was about a 4-acre piece that included the historic tomb.
Yeah, and that's in this piece too. It's included in this.
I understand that, yeah. But you have it open for public purposes, but it's all wet, a lot of it's damp and wet and.
You're right, and there will be a boardwalk. They're not going to allow people to walk down the path anymore from Hingham Mutual. There'll be a boardwalk to
Yeah.
cover across it. I don't know why it's not 4 acres. I don't have that information, but I can find out for you.
Thank you. Now, the acceptance of easements, question on that? Is there any description in the acceptance of easements so that it'll be clear to the public of, after you give them an easement, how are they going to maintain it?
I haven't seen this year's article. It just came up. It was actually an omission. We didn't have it in the original list of warrant articles. I'm assuming the text will be very similar to prior years, but I don't have it in front of me.
Well, the concern is if you could add language to it so that it's explanation to everybody that's voting for it. If I give you an easement, I want to know how you're going to take care of it. You
Understood.
know what I'm saying? And so when you don't, you see what I'm saying? Is there a rollback or a whatever?
I will pursue that and find out for you.
I can't read them.
Excuse me?
Never mind. Call someone else.
Do you have another question?
Can't find it. Oh, the gymnasium wall. What's the issue? A redesign or something? Clear glass we're going to put in or something?
Someone discovered a structural problem that could be a risk, and I have not seen it. I don't know. Our town engineer has looked at it, and several independent engineers have looked at it. And rather than put money aside this year to fix it, we don't really know the total scope of the work. So they're going to do a full structural assessment and come up with a design plan for what needs to be done. I don't know whether it's a part of a wall, the whole wall, the windows. I think originally it was the window portion of the wall. If you're in the gym and you look up, you see the walls. I don't know
Yeah.
which side it's on, but
Was that redone when they redid the high school?
I don't think the gym was redone, was it? I don't,
No.
I think it was all
I have the text of the article if you want.
Oh, you do, there, see.
of,
It includes what they're looking at.
for the gym?
Yeah.
A sum of money to assess and provide designer services, this is the new one that just got replaced, for the replacement of the glass block windows at the high school gymnasium and related work which may involve structural support work, including masonry repointing, flashing, roof repair or replacement, replacing heating units, and other ancillary work which would be necessitated by the replacement project. It's a very broad article. We don't know exactly what we're going to need, and we could see an article next year to raise the funds to pay for it.
No, the concern was the glass goes all the way along the frieze, so
Yep.
to speak, right?
Yep.
And is there one section that's bad? or
I
is-
don't have the details.
Know what I mean? Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Well, we're right at 8 o'clock, so I thank you all for coming. And if you do have questions, come see me afterward. If I don't have the information, I'll get back to you. I welcome your questions, and don't forget the website's out there if you have other information you want to get. Okay? Thank you.